The fastest way to discover who really owns something is to tell the wrong person no. I didn't fully understand how true that was until the morning I watched nearly 24 luxury SUVs line up outside a locked steel gate, their engines idling while confused homeowners stared across the water toward lake houses they suddenly couldn't reach. The air smelled like fresh pine and wet earth after an overnight rain, and the surface of the lake reflected the first streaks of sunrise so perfectly it looked like polished glass. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was arguing. They were simply waiting, trying to understand why the only road leading into the private lakeside neighborhood had become inaccessible overnight. 24 hours earlier, those same people had applauded when our HOA board voted to reject my $63,500 repair invoice without even reading the engineering report attached to it. Standing beside the newly secured access gate with a folder tucked beneath my arm, I quietly watched the realization spread from one vehicle to the next. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm a civil engineer, and I've spent nearly 20 years solving problems that most people never notice until something collapses, floods, or fails. Bridges, retaining walls, drainage systems, access roads. Those are the things I understand better than most conversations. I don't raise my voice when people disagree with me. I trust calculations more than opinions, documents more than assumptions, and facts more than politics. That's probably why the board underestimated me from the very beginning. 6 weeks earlier, after an unusually severe series of storms swept through our Colorado mountain community, the only road connecting the neighborhood to the lake houses began to sink near the reinforced spillway. Water had carved channels beneath the asphalt, sections of the retaining wall were beginning to separate, and every inspection I performed pointed toward the same conclusion. If immediate repairs weren't completed, the road could become unsafe for emergency vehicles before the next heavy rainfall. I presented everything to the HOA with photographs, engineering measurements, drainage calculations, and contractor estimates. They debated landscaping expenses longer than they discussed the road. Eventually, they voted to delay the project because they believed the damage wasn't their responsibility. I couldn't accept that decision. Ambulances, firefighters, utility crews, and every homeowner depended on that road. Waiting wasn't an option. I hired contractors myself, supervised every repair personally, stabilized the retaining wall, reinforced the drainage channels, resurfaced the damaged pavement, and documented every invoice down to the last dollar. The final cost came to exactly $63,500. I wasn't asking for a favor when I submitted the invoice. I was asking the HOA to reimburse necessary emergency repairs that protected every lake house in the neighborhood. During the following board meeting, Margaret Collins, our HOA President, barely glanced at the engineering report before sliding the invoice back across the polished conference table. With a polite smile that somehow felt colder than an outright insult, she said the association wouldn't pay a single cent because, in her words, the road wasn't their problem. Around the room, several board members nodded without asking a single question. I gathered my documents, thanked them for their time, and walked out without another word. What Margaret didn't know was that her refusal had just given me a reason to look much deeper into something that everyone in the neighborhood had taken for granted for decades: who actually owned the only road leading to every lake house on that shoreline. The next morning, I drove straight to the Jefferson County Clerk and Recorder's office instead of returning to my engineering firm. If the board believed the road was not their responsibility, I wanted to understand exactly why they sounded so certain. Most people assume ownership is obvious because a neighborhood has existed for decades, but civil engineering teaches you something different. Roads, drainage systems, easements, and utility corridors often carry legal histories that stretch back farther than anyone currently living there. I requested the original subdivision plats, historical deeds, easement agreements, and every recorded survey connected to our lakeside community. The clerk disappeared into the archive for nearly half an hour before returning with several oversized map tubes and a stack of aging record books whose pages carried the unmistakable scent of old paper and dust. As I carefully unfolded the first subdivision plat across a large wooden table, I immediately noticed details that nobody on our board had ever mentioned during any meeting. The neighborhood boundaries matched the modern maps almost perfectly, but one narrow strip of land surrounding the entrance road had been labeled separately from every residential lot. My curiosity turned into professional focus. I compared that drawing with another survey recorded several years later, then another one filed after additional lake houses had been constructed. The property lines changed slightly over time, yet the entrance corridor remained remarkably consistent. Something about that consistency did not happen by accident. I ordered certified copies and continued tracing every document forward through decades of ownership transfers. Several hours later, I found an easement agreement signed by the original developer. Instead of transferring ownership of the entrance road to the Homeowners Association, the developer had granted a permanent right of access across privately owned land while assigning specific maintenance obligations to whoever benefited from that access. I read the language again, slower this time. Then I read it a third time. Every sentence seemed carefully written to separate ownership from usage. That distinction may sound minor, but in property law, it can change everything. I left the courthouse carrying a folder far thicker than the one Margaret had ignored the previous afternoon. Over the following week, I spent every evening reviewing county records, historical aerial photographs, tax parcel maps, and engineering files until the timeline became completely clear. My grandfather had purchased a large tract of mountain property long before the subdivision existed. Years later, the developer acquired surrounding acreage, built the neighborhood, and negotiated an easement allowing residents to cross the portion of land my family had retained. Ownership of the road itself had never actually transferred. Generation after generation, everyone simply assumed the association owned it because they maintained the landscaping, collected dues, and controlled the neighborhood entrance signs. Assumptions have a strange way of becoming accepted facts when nobody bothers to verify the paperwork. Before allowing myself to reach any conclusions, I contacted a licensed title company and requested a complete chain of title for the entrance corridor. If I was right, the answer would not come from opinions during an HOA meeting. It would come from recorded documents that had been sitting quietly inside county archives for decades, waiting for someone willing to read every single page. 3 days later, the title company called and asked whether I could come into their office in person because the documents they had assembled were too extensive to explain over the phone. That sentence alone told me I had not imagined what I was seeing inside the county archives. Their conference room overlooked a busy downtown street, but my attention never left the large collection of certified records spread across the polished table. Every deed, parcel transfer, subdivision amendment, and recorded easement had been arranged into a chronological timeline. The senior title examiner adjusted his glasses, pointed toward the oldest document, and calmly walked me through nearly 50 years of property history. My grandfather's original parcel had never disappeared. It had been divided, refinished, and partially sold over several transactions. But one narrow strip containing the entrance road had remained within the family trust before eventually transferring to me after my father's estate was settled. The examiner paused before sliding another document across the table. It was the original easement agreement I had already found, now accompanied by several legal opinions recorded over the following decades. None of them transferred ownership. Every one of them reinforced the same principle. The Homeowners Association possessed a legal right to cross the property only so long as it fulfilled specific obligations concerning maintenance, drainage protection, and reasonable access. As an engineer, those maintenance clauses immediately caught my attention because they matched the exact failures I had documented before authorizing the emergency repairs. The damaged retaining wall, neglected drainage channels, deteriorating asphalt, and unstable shoulder conditions were not random maintenance issues. They represented responsibilities specifically assigned to the association under the easement itself. I thanked the examiner and drove directly to the office of a real estate attorney recommended by the title company. Rather than telling him my conclusions, I handed him every certified document and asked him to review everything independently. He spent nearly 2 hours reading through the records while I quietly waited. Occasionally, he highlighted a paragraph, made handwritten notes, or compared one survey to another. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and smiled in the restrained way experienced attorneys do when they discover something unexpectedly significant. He explained that ownership and access rights are often misunderstood because people assume the organization maintaining a road automatically owns it. In this situation, the recorded documents suggested something entirely different. The association benefited from the easement, but continued access depended upon compliance with the obligations written into the agreement decades earlier. Ignoring essential maintenance while refusing reimbursement for emergency repairs could create serious legal consequences, especially if those repairs preserve the very infrastructure supporting continued access. Even then, he cautioned me against making assumptions until a licensed land surveyor physically verified every recorded boundary. I agreed immediately because engineering has taught me that measurements matter more than confidence. 2 survey crews spent the following week locating original monuments, confirming property corners, and comparing modern GPS measurements with historical plats. When the final survey arrived, every recorded line matched the county documents almost exactly. The entrance corridor leading to every lake house remained on property legally owned by me, while the association's rights existed solely through the easement they had been treating as permanent ownership for years. I did not celebrate after reading the report. Instead, I placed the survey beside the engineering invoices, the maintenance photographs, and the attorney's legal opinion inside one organized binder. For the first time since the board rejected my repair bill, I understood that this dispute had never been about $63,500 alone. It was about decades of assumptions that had quietly replaced the truth until one overlooked document brought everything back into the light. By the time every survey, title report, and legal opinion had been organized into a single binder, I was no longer interested in proving anyone wrong. I wanted to give the association one final opportunity to solve the problem the right way. My attorney drafted a formal letter that was respectful, detailed, and supported by every certified document we had collected. It explained that the emergency repairs had preserved the only access road serving the lake houses, that the maintenance obligations outlined in the recorded easement had not been fulfilled, and that I was requesting reimbursement of the documented repair costs along with a meeting to discuss updating the decades-old easement before another infrastructure failure created even greater liability. We attached engineering reports, contractor invoices, photographs taken before and after construction, certified surveys, and copies of the recorded property documents. Everything was delivered by certified mail and electronic copy to every member of the board. For several days I heard nothing. Then Margaret scheduled a special board meeting at the clubhouse. The room filled quickly with board members, homeowners, and the association's attorney. My binder rested quietly on the conference table while Margaret opened the meeting with practiced confidence. She thanked everyone for attending before announcing that the board had reviewed my request. Without discussing the surveys or the recorded easement, she declared that the association would not reimburse the repair expenses because they believed maintaining the entrance road had been my personal decision. I calmly asked whether every board member had reviewed the certified title report and the county records included with the letter. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room before one director admitted he had only read the summary prepared for the meeting. Another quietly said he had not seen the survey at all. Margaret immediately redirected the conversation, insisting that ownership questions were irrelevant because the neighborhood had always operated the same way. That statement caught the attention of the association's attorney, who politely requested a short recess so he could examine the complete binder himself. While everyone stepped into the hallway for coffee, I remained seated, watching sunlight reflect across the lake through the clubhouse windows. The same peaceful water that made this neighborhood beautiful had also hidden years of neglected maintenance beneath its quiet appearance. About 20 minutes later, the attorney returned carrying my binder. His expression was noticeably more serious than when the meeting had begun. He did not argue with me, and he did not agree with me publicly either. Instead, he advised the board that additional review of the recorded documents would be appropriate before making any final statements concerning ownership or easement responsibilities. Margaret thanked him for the recommendation but immediately called for a vote anyway. One by one, the directors voted to reject my request in full. The decision passed unanimously. I simply nodded, collected my binder, and wished everyone a pleasant evening. As I reached the parking lot, my attorney looked at me and quietly said that the board had just made an extremely expensive mistake. The following morning, he prepared another certified letter, this time notifying the association that because the easement obligations had been repeatedly breached and reimbursement had been formally refused despite documented evidence, I intended to exercise every legal remedy available under the recorded agreement. There were no threats, no dramatic language, and no deadlines designed to create panic. Every sentence referred directly to recorded documents, established property law, and the obligations both parties had accepted decades earlier. While the board believed the meeting had ended the dispute, I knew it had only marked the moment when assumptions finally collided with legally recorded reality. 5 business days after the certified notice was delivered, my attorney received a brief response from the association's legal counsel requesting additional time to evaluate the documents. That alone told me the board had finally realized the situation was far more complicated than a reimbursement dispute. We granted the extension without objection because neither of us was interested in creating unnecessary pressure. We wanted the facts to speak for themselves. During that week, I continued my normal engineering projects while quietly preparing for whatever came next. Then another letter arrived, this time confirming that the association still rejected responsibility for the repair costs and intended to continue operating under its existing interpretation of the easement. My attorney read the letter twice before placing it beside the certified survey and simply saying, "Now we move to the next step." Within 48 hours, licensed contractors arrived at the entrance corridor, not with heavy construction equipment, but with clearly marked utility vehicles carrying temporary fencing, electronic access equipment, and professionally fabricated signs explaining that access conditions had changed pursuant to the recorded easement and ongoing legal review. Every installation had already been approved through the appropriate permits, and every document had been reviewed by counsel before a single post entered the ground. Watching the work crews operate reminded me of any other engineering project. There was no urgency, no confrontation, only careful measurements, documented procedures, and quiet professionalism. The existing entrance gate remained in place, but its operating system was replaced with new electronic controls managed through the property owner rather than the association. Emergency service access codes were immediately provided to the county, local fire department, emergency medical services, and utility companies to ensure public safety remained completely uninterrupted. Residents already inside the lake community were fully informed that they could continue leaving whenever necessary. The only change involved future entry through the privately owned corridor until the legal issues surrounding the easement were resolved. By sunrise the following morning, the first homeowners returning from work, school, or early errands slowed their vehicles as they approached the entrance. One after another, they stopped beside the new information signs and pressed their access cards against readers that no longer responded. Confused expressions replaced routine morning habits. Some drivers rolled down their windows to read the posted legal notice, while others made telephone calls from inside their vehicles. Nobody argued with the contractors because there were no contractors left on site. Everything had already been completed quietly during the previous evening. Within an hour, Margaret arrived in her sport utility vehicle and stepped out carrying several folders beneath her arm. She carefully read every posted notice before looking toward the reinforced road that only weeks earlier had been on the verge of failure. I watched from a respectful distance without approaching her. A few minutes later, the association's attorney arrived, reviewed the documents, and immediately began making telephone calls of his own. His body language alone suggested he understood exactly why every word on those signs referenced recorded property records, certified surveys, and specific easement provisions instead of emotional arguments. By mid-morning, county officials had confirmed that emergency access remained fully protected and that the matter appeared to involve a private property dispute governed by recorded agreements. For the first time since this entire situation began, the conversation was no longer about whether my repair invoice had been too expensive. It had become a discussion about ownership, responsibility, and the legal foundation upon which the entire lakeside neighborhood had quietly depended for decades without ever questioning who truly controlled the road beneath their tires. The atmosphere around the entrance road changed completely over the next 2 days. What had once been treated as a simple disagreement over a repair invoice had become a carefully documented legal matter that every homeowner wanted to understand. My telephone never stopped ringing. Some residents were frustrated because they believed the association had always owned the road. Others apologized for assumptions they admitted they had never questioned before. I answered every call the same way. I explained that this had never been about keeping anyone away from their homes. Emergency vehicles, utility crews, deliveries authorized under the temporary procedures, and every essential public service continued operating without interruption. The temporary access controls existed for one reason only: to enforce the recorded easement after repeated violations had gone unresolved. Late that afternoon, my attorney received a request from the association's legal counsel asking for an immediate settlement meeting. We agreed to meet the following morning inside the county administration building rather than the clubhouse. The location mattered because it removed the conversation from neighborhood politics and placed it inside a professional environment where only documents, engineering reports, and recorded facts carried any weight. Margaret arrived with the association's attorney and several board members. She looked noticeably different from the confident woman who had dismissed my engineering report only days earlier. There was no anger in her expression now, only the unmistakable realization that the assumptions guiding the board's decisions had been incomplete. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. My attorney carefully presented the chain of title, certified surveys, maintenance records, engineering photographs, contractor invoices, and the original easement agreement. The association's attorney reviewed each exhibit one by one, occasionally comparing language across multiple recorded documents. At one point, he quietly acknowledged that the maintenance obligations described in the easement aligned with the infrastructure failures documented before the emergency repairs. That single observation changed the direction of the discussion. Instead of debating ownership, everyone began discussing solutions. Margaret finally spoke with a calm voice that was far different from the one I had heard during the board meeting. She admitted that the association had relied upon decades of informal practice instead of verifying the original property records and asked what it would take to restore normal access for the community. I answered honestly. I wanted reimbursement for the documented emergency repairs, payment of the certified survey expenses, reasonable legal costs directly related to enforcing the easement, and a completely updated recorded agreement that clearly assigned future maintenance responsibilities so another misunderstanding could never place the neighborhood at risk again. Nobody interrupted. The room remained remarkably quiet while both attorneys reviewed the proposal. After another hour of discussion, the association agreed in principle to every major point. Draft settlement documents began taking shape that same afternoon, and both legal teams scheduled a final review before anything would be signed. As I walked out of the county building, I looked across the mountains rising beyond the courthouse parking lot and realized how differently the entire situation could have ended if pride had continued driving every decision. Instead, patient documentation, careful engineering, and respect for the law had slowly replaced assumptions with facts. For the first time since the storms damaged that entrance road, I felt confident the community was finally moving toward a solution that protected not only my legal rights, but also the long-term future of every family living beside the lake. Over the next several days, the settlement draft moved back and forth between both legal teams until every sentence reflected the same precision I expected from an engineering blueprint. Nothing was left to interpretation. Every maintenance obligation, inspection schedule, drainage responsibility, emergency repair procedure, and access provision was written in clear language supported by recorded property references. My attorney insisted that if the community was going to avoid repeating decades of confusion, every future board member needed to understand exactly where responsibility began and ended without relying on assumptions or neighborhood tradition. Margaret attended each negotiation session personally. The confidence that had once driven every board meeting had been replaced by careful questions and a willingness to verify every document before reaching another conclusion. During one meeting, she quietly admitted that the board had inherited old practices without ever reviewing the original county records themselves. I respected her honesty because acknowledging a mistake in front of fellow board members required far more courage than pretending nothing had happened. By the end of the week, the financial terms were finalized. The association agreed to reimburse the full $63,500 for the documented emergency repairs, cover the certified survey expenses, reimburse reasonable legal fees directly connected to enforcing the easement, and establish a dedicated infrastructure reserve fund to ensure critical maintenance would never again be postponed because of budget debates. For me, That final provision mattered almost as much as the reimbursement itself. Roads, retaining walls, drainage systems, and emergency access routes quietly protect communities every day, but people often notice them only after something begins to fail. As an engineer, I wanted lasting prevention, not temporary victory. A few days later, both parties gathered inside the title company's conference room for the formal signing. Thick folders containing the revised easement, updated maintenance agreement, survey exhibits, and county recording forms covered the polished oak table. Each page was reviewed one final time before signatures were placed exactly where indicated. Once the documents were executed, the title company immediately prepared them for recording with the county, so the updated agreement would become part of the permanent public record. There would be no uncertainty for future homeowners, future board members, or future property managers. Everything would now be transparent and legally documented. That afternoon, I authorized the access control contractor to restore normal electronic entry through the gate under the newly recorded terms. As the system returned to regular operation, residents gradually drove into the lakeside neighborhood without delays or confusion. Many slowed as they passed, offering a friendly wave or a simple nod of appreciation. Several homeowners later stopped by my house carrying handwritten thank you notes, explaining that they had never realized how much unseen work had gone into protecting the community's infrastructure until the legal records brought everything into the open. Even Margaret visited a few days later. Standing on my front porch beneath the cool mountain breeze, she thanked me for remaining patient throughout the process instead of allowing frustration to guide my decisions. I told her the same thing I believed from the very beginning. Engineering teaches you that strong foundations are built long before anyone notices them, and communities work the same way. Trust is not created through authority alone. It is built through accountability, careful planning, and a willingness to accept documented facts even when they challenge long-held assumptions. As she drove away, I looked toward the quiet lake reflecting the afternoon sun and realized that the strongest structure we had rebuilt was not the entrance road itself, but the foundation of responsibility beneath the entire neighborhood. Autumn settled gently over the mountains during the weeks that followed, and with every passing day the neighborhood looked a little different. The entrance road that had once been the center of uncertainty became one of the most carefully maintained pieces of infrastructure in the entire community. Fresh pavement markings reflected beneath the morning sun, drainage channels remained clear after every rainfall, and the repaired retaining wall stood exactly as it had been designed to perform. As I drove through the gate one crisp Saturday morning, I noticed something I had never seen before. A small inspection crew hired by the association was walking the entire roadway with maintenance checklists, measuring drainage flow, photographing culverts, and documenting minor issues before they could become expensive repairs. Instead of waiting for problems to grow into emergencies, the board had adopted a preventive maintenance schedule based on the engineering recommendations we had included in the settlement. That simple change quietly transformed the culture of the neighborhood. During the next homeowners meeting, attendance was larger than usual, but the atmosphere felt completely different from the tense gathering where my reimbursement request had been dismissed. The conversation focused on transparency, budgeting, and long-term planning rather than assumptions or personalities. Margaret opened the meeting by presenting the new Infrastructure Reserve Fund and explained exactly how future maintenance dollars would be allocated. Every homeowner received copies of the updated easement summary, inspection calendar, and maintenance responsibilities so no future board would have to rely on incomplete information again. Listening from the back of the room, I realized that the most valuable outcome had never been the reimbursement check itself. It was the fact that everyone now understood how easily a community could drift away from the documents that originally protected it. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me to ask questions about engineering, drainage systems, and road maintenance. Many admitted they had never considered what happened beneath the pavement they drove across every day. I smiled because that is the nature of infrastructure. When it works properly, almost nobody notices it. Later that afternoon, I walked along the shoreline where children laughed as they launched colorful kayaks into the calm water, while families fished from the dock and neighbors gathered beneath tall pine trees for a community picnic. The lake reflected bright blue skies instead of uncertainty, and the repaired access road blended naturally into the landscape as though the dispute had never happened. Yet every time I crossed that entrance corridor, I remembered the old county maps, the faded easement agreement, and the overlooked records that had quietly preserved the truth for decades. My engineering firm eventually received several consulting requests from nearby communities after homeowners heard how our neighborhood had modernized its infrastructure planning. I accepted a few of those projects because they shared the same lesson. Good engineering is not only about concrete, asphalt, or steel. It is also about protecting people through careful planning long before failure becomes visible. Looking back, I realized that every certified survey, every engineering calculation, every legal review, and every calm conversation had contributed to rebuilding far more than a roadway. Together, they restored confidence between neighbors, replaced uncertainty with accountability, and proved that the strongest communities are built on facts that everyone is willing to respect, even when those facts challenge traditions that had gone unquestioned for generations. Nearly a year has passed since that quiet morning when a single locked gate forced an entire neighborhood to rediscover the difference between assumption and ownership, and every time I drive along the entrance road beside the lake, I find myself noticing the little things that most people overlook. The drainage channels remain clean after every storm. The retaining wall stands exactly as it was designed to perform. Fresh inspection tags appear on utility structures every season, and maintenance crews arrive before problems become emergencies instead of after damage has already been done. The infrastructure has become almost invisible again, which, to an engineer, is the greatest compliment any project can receive. When people stop thinking about a road, it usually means the road is doing exactly what it was built to do. The neighborhood itself has changed as well. New board members now receive complete orientation packets containing the recorded easement, certified surveys, maintenance schedules, and property records before attending their first official meeting. Every important decision involving shared infrastructure is reviewed alongside the original county documents instead of relying on stories passed from one volunteer board to another. Margaret remained on the board long enough to help implement those reforms before choosing not to seek another term. The final time we spoke during a community cleanup event beside the lake, she smiled and admitted that the experience had permanently changed the way she viewed leadership. She said authority means very little if it is separated from responsibility, and I could not disagree. There was no bitterness left between us because the conflict had never truly been personal. It had always been about understanding the obligations that came with the rights everyone enjoyed. My reimbursement check had long since been deposited, the legal files had been archived, and the revised easement had become just another recorded document resting quietly inside the county archives where future generations could find it if they ever needed the truth. My engineering firm continued to grow, and from time to time I received invitations to speak with neighborhood associations about preventive maintenance, infrastructure planning, and the importance of reviewing original property records before making expensive decisions. I always began those conversations the same way. I told them that roads, bridges, drainage systems, and easements rarely fail overnight. They fail after years of small misunderstandings, delayed maintenance, and misplaced confidence that someone else is paying attention. Communities work exactly the same way. Trust is built slowly through transparency, accountability, and respect for facts, then quietly protected through consistent action. Sometimes people ask whether everything that happened was worth the stress. I always answer yes, but probably not for the reason they expect. The $63,500 mattered because it represented fairness, yet the money was never the real victory. The real victory was watching an entire community replace assumption with knowledge, replace pride with cooperation, and replace uncertainty with a foundation strong enough to support everyone who called that lakeside neighborhood home. As the sun settles behind the Colorado mountains each evening and golden light stretches across the calm water, I often pause for a moment before driving home. The lake looks peaceful now, just as it did before any of this began, but I know something most people driving beside it will never realize. The strongest foundations are usually the ones nobody notices, quietly doing their job every single day, proving that justice does not have to be loud to change everything. It only has to stand on solid ground.